Hello, my name is Fred Trotter, and I said I'd go live for this little show in one whole minute. So I'm going to wait and let people show up, and then I'll get going real quick here. This will play on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, but I'm only going to try to watch the event on LinkedIn. So if you want to chat with me or get my attention while I'm doing this presentation, it'll have to be on LinkedIn. No, okay. All right, so thank you for joining me. This, obviously, most people don't bother to log in and watch while I'm recording these, but they'll be up on LinkedIn and YouTube forever. I don't know what happens on Twitter. I assume they go away. It's a beautiful morning here in Washington, D.C. I thinking about what I would like to dedicate this video to, and I've just had some waffles for breakfast. And it's funny because the restaurant that gave me the waffles, obviously they just used exactly the same batter that they use for pancakes, and yet the structure and shape of the waffle makes me like it much better. So I guess this session will be sponsored by waffles because who wants flat pancakes? Instead, you have a waffle. So thank you to Waffles for sponsoring this content. So this is I'm talking about data, owning and licensing data, and from the perspective of an open data project. So I'm working with an open source project called Mirrulations, and Mirrulations is about to release some open data based on regulatory comment data, which I'm really excited about. I'm looking forward to what they are doing. And there's some questions about like what should that project, how should that project approach its data licensing? And in order to have that discussion, I promised I'd make a video. And of course, if I want to make a video, I want to stream my video so that I can, encourage my audience on Twitter to move over to LinkedIn and follow me on LinkedIn, because I'm afraid Twitter is going to become accessible at any minute. So, that's my concern. That's one of the reasons why I'm doing these shows, is just because I have a huge amount. There's so many people who are following me on Twitter who are interested in health policy and how health policy and technology interact. And if you care about that stuff and you are following me on Twitter, well, come follow me on LinkedIn or reach out to me on LinkedIn, because again, I just don't know. I don't know if Twitter has a future as a platform, and I'm concerned about that. So with that in mind, welcome. And I'm just going to jump right in to a talk about owning and licensing data. And this will allow me to show you the slides at the same time you can see me clearly. So, when we're thinking about owning and licensing data, first thing is I'm not a lawyer. If I was a lawyer, I wouldn't be your lawyer. Sometimes you need a lawyer. If you have to wonder whether or not you need a lawyer, then you do. I think is the right way to think about issues of this type. No, I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure out how to maybe this one. Maybe this one. No. How about this one? I'm just trying to figure out how to see who's chatting to me on LinkedIn. Okay, now I can see. Now I'm looking at myself here, and I can say welcome to people, which is a little bit self-referential and weird. Okay, apparently I failed to post a comment, so apparently you can't do that. Oh, well. Anyways, owning and licensing data. I'm not a lawyer. If you need a lawyer who's got experience with intellectual property, or as I kind of like to say, thought work ownership topics, I'm not your person, right? You need to go hire somebody, and that person cannot be me. So I think the reason I want to kind of throw that out there is I do think that Richard Stallman's comments, and again, I'm coming at this from an open source and open data background. Richard Stallman's comments on intellectual property, I think, ring true here, where he's pointing out that intellectual property is one of these terms that is like implicitly ironic, like military intelligence or reality television. Like reality television is very obviously based on the concept of someone who does not understand either one of those two concepts well, putting them together, right? It's not television and it's not reality, but it's reality television, which is neither one of those things. And so in the same way, the idea that you can own an idea is actually we should regard that as a very controversial idea and counterintuitive. And when you think about the modern infrastructure of the internet and the capacity to, share things, it is exactly not like property, right? With real property, I own a chair, you can't sit in it. I own a car, you can't drive it. I own a bed, you can't sleep in it, right? I own a house, you can't live there, right? That's when we talk about the idea of real property ownership, it is exclusionary, and it's not exclusionary because we make it exclusionary. It's exclusionary because it inherently is. And so we have all of these rules to think about how we parse these things out and how we handle the concept of ownership. And when we think about an idea, but also just anything digital, it's not clear that should apply. So I can take a cat picture and I can share it with every person or every other person on the planet using the internet. It's not clear why that needs to be protected in the same way that my home does or my car does. It doesn't make sense, right? So, and so when you hear the term intellectual property, what I hope you can train yourself to do is to say, all right, someone is about to make the case that some thought work or some result of an intellectual process or some idea or some resource in some medium that is not inherently capable of being trapped and constrained and owned by a single person. We're going to talk about the ways in which you make it act like that a little bit. But in the paradigms of the underlying ideas of copyright, trademark, patents, trade secrets, I think you probably should add things like network effects, like having a bunch of users is probably a kind of intellectual property now that's not legally intellectual property, but ends up being an asset, a thought work asset that probably counts. But if you think about these classic 4 topics that are the kinds of things you would learn in Business Class 101 or Intellectual Property 101, ironically named, there's no reason in any of these paradigms that they are alike to each other, like they don't actually have any similarities or relationships inherently with each other, and they don't have any relationship. I think you could argue that they do have, like they're carving up a different the space, arguably, about what things are going to be protected and how, that are not real property, but then none of them act like in any way real property, right? So when you hear someone say intellectual property, I think people like Stallman insist that you correct them. Don't use this inaccurate language, but I think it's enough to know that you're using a brand for an idea. You're essentially using a slogan, and sometimes slogans are great, sometimes they suck. And I'm not sure this is a good slogan. I don't think this is necessarily the right starting place for thinking about these ideas. 4 components that are on the IP umbrella, or this kind of thought work groupings: trade secrets, trademarks, which I'm not going to talk about today because they're not super relevant, patents, which I will talk a little bit about, mostly because some things that are patentable end up not being copyrightable, and then copyrights, which is the thing that normally you think about whether or not data is copyrightable is the big question. So these are the four kinds of laws that are generally lumped together as IP. They are certainly a system of rights for kind of ideas, and so they are similar in that respect. Let's talk about patents. Methods are patentable, and of course the standards for what is a patentable method and what is a computer method, this have all been changing over the last couple of decades. But you can think about something that is not copyrightable, which is a recipe. A recipe is not copyrightable. It's a classic example of something that is inherently in the public domain. And a recipe for a medication, which is to say a way to make a particular medication or a particular chemical compound that has some benefit, clinical benefit, it is patentable, right? And this is a good example of a thought work paradigm that is very effective, right? We have a slew of safe medications that are not patented anymore that are of great use to the world. And so what I think is really notable, though, is that a lot of things that are not copyrightable are patentable. And beyond that, I'm not really going to talk about patents. So when you say something is copyrightable, in some senses, it's useful just to start from the outset and talk about what is not copyrightable. And data is, I think, substantially in this commentary. This is a small enough side. If you don't mind, I'm going to switch this back to the kind of tiny view here. And then I'm going to see if I can do this effectively. Yeah, that's good. All right, it's a little bit easier for you to read, I hope. I wonder if does that? Well, no, okay, that's good enough. So there's this QR code sends you to a lovely link, which is where I kind of started this list off from the link. It's from the Authors Alliance, which I really enjoyed all the materials that they have. And we've got several articles that are really linked together that I have linked. This is the first thing that you can click around that link, and they've got some really good materials of this. So if copyright is expired, of course, the most famous expiring copyright is the Mickey Mouse Steamboat video, which I think has just gone into the public domain. And after years and years of Disney paying Congress people to ensure that it did not go into the public domain, it finally has. So you can have expired copyrights. You can have abandoned copyrights, which it takes work to abandon something before now. I think it was before the 1960s or 1970s, if you didn't do things, your copyright could become abandoned. But those requirements for things you had to do, the registering with the Copyright Office, those things have been removed. And so now you actually have to do work in order to make something that could be copyrightable that you produce and turn it into something that is public domain. It actually takes work now. You have to do things. So those things, once it's expired or abandoned, things that used to be copyrighted then become public domain. Things that are uncopyrightable, and I think actually I'm just going to open this. This is a .gov website, and they're just going to talk ideas, methods, and systems are not patentable. Inventions are not patentable. Recipes are not patentable. Names, titles, and short slogans not patentable. A domain name is not copyrightable. I'm saying not patentable. I should be saying not copyrightable this whole time, so please forgive me. The name of a character is not copyrightable. Catchwords, catchphrases, slogans, mottos, names, ironically, typeface and font, layout and design, blank forms. I think this is so interesting. I never would have thought that's an uncopyrightable thing. But this is this list. And then there's more things like, very common. You can't copyright an arrow. Like you can't say my arrow is new and different and creative, and so you can't draw arrows my way. religious symbols, architectural moldings. So there's a huge number of things that don't count. And I would definitely at least review this document as you're thinking about what is copyrightable and not. Some things in there that I wanted to highlight is themes, works not created by a human. We'll talk about those things. And then these last four are the ones that are relevant to the Mirrulations project. And so I'm going to be talking about them in a little more detail and relevant to open data in general. So let's talk about themes. You can't create a work of fiction or something like the work of fiction and then say, well, I own this whole idea, this whole theme. So for instance, a children's author sued Jurassic Park and said, I wrote a book about a dinosaur zoo, and then you did this whole film about a dinosaur zoo, and you're infringing on my copyright. The court says, no, that's a theme. It's not copyrightable. Someone sues the Harry Potter franchise and says, I wrote a book about a children's wizarding competition. And now you've got a children's wizarding competition, and that's my copyright. And then the court says, no, that's a theme. You can't copyright a theme. So they held against the person who sued the Harry Potter folks. And then last one is the Monsters, Inc. Was sued because there was someone who wrote a children's book about the monster having a scary child in the closet, which is, a wonderful role reversal and a flipping of a stereotype there. And the idea of a scary child in a monster's closet, which was the theme of the Monsters, Inc. movie. Again, that's a theme, not copyrightable. And again, this is another article that I'm linking to in the QR code here from the Authors Alliance, and which is where I got my 3 examples, which I really thought that was an excellent article if you want to spend some more time thinking about themes. Themes are not copyrightable. This is a famous case where Wikipedia sued the owner of an image and said to be copyrightable, it must be a creative and expressive work, right? This is the kind of things that are protected under copyright. So a book or software that you write or something that is the result of a human being being creative. And if it's not a human being, it doesn't count. And this, obviously you can't tell, but because you can't see the monkey's hands, but the monkey is holding the camera and taking a selfie. Now, of course, the person who arranged for this animal to be holding the camera and for the camera to respond in ways that made sense, you argue was being very creative in making sure that situation arose. And I think the photographer who owned the camera was doing something else to get it so where this would happen. But nonetheless, because the picture was technically taken by an animal, that is not copyrightable material. So this is a famous case, which ends up being extraordinarily important as we start thinking about artificial intelligence. So facts are not copyrightable. Neither are asserted truths, and that ends up meaning raw data is not copyrightable. So for instance, I weigh about 300 pounds, not something I'm thrilled about, but true nonetheless. I hope I wear it okay, but that's a lot of weight. And that is something that I can go to a scale and I could find out maybe it's 295 or 301 or whatever it is today. That is not something I can copyright. That's a thing that's true about the world, right? Now, if I assert that I weigh 200 pounds, that's totally incorrect in all respects. But that assertion is still not copyrightable. It's not an act of creativity to have the wrong data about something. Right, so facts or facts that are things that are attempting to be facts, but are in fact incorrect, neither one of those things are copyrightable. And when you collect an enormous number of them in one place, which is what I think which is the definition of raw data, that is not copyrightable either. And so when we say raw and raw data, we mean that the contents of a database does not have anything that is expressive and creative, right? So if you imagine you had a poetry database, if you have copyrighted material in the rows of data that are the poems, well, then your data, the fact that it's in a database doesn't change the copyrightability of the underlying information. But if the underlying information, if a single row of data is not copyrightable, the fact that you have a million of them doesn't make it copyrightable. The other thing that is been a really important line in the sand about like how much creativity it takes for something not to be raw data, which is not copyrightable, and become something that is copyrightable, is that a mere numbering system does not count. And the famous case for this was a phone book case, right, where somebody copied all of the contents of the phone number and sent out a new phone book that had the listings of, John Smith is at 45125, whatever phone number it is. The courts held that like this is not a creative thing, right? You've created a new fact about the world, but John Smith's phone number is whatever it is, and therefore does not count as copyrightable. So the courts held with the person who created copied the contents of this phone book and then republished a phone book. So moving on to the things that are super relevant for the Mirrulations. Government-generated works are public domain. This includes two different piles of data. One, works created by the federal government, federal employees, et cetera, et cetera. So the VA Vista operating system, or the VA Vista electronic healthcare record, is FOIA available. And it's FOIA available because it was written by government employees, and anything that is a FOIA available is public domain, and anything that is a work created by federal employees and the federal government is also public domain. This is also part of the generative policy and lawmaking under edicts of government, which is super relevant to the Mirrulations project, which is considering regulatory data under the principle of edicts of government. The data that comes out of the regulations.gov API is public domain. So it's not just that I think probably you could ask for a copy of the source code to regulations.gov and you probably get a copy too, because that's not necessarily true. It's possibly licensed software to do that, but it's also possible that if they did actually write it with, create the software with federal dollars or with federal employees writing the code, that can be available too. So in general, things that the federal government of the United States generates are public domain. I should probably mention at this point that this is a very US-centric view of the world. So the standards for copyrights vary all over the world, and there are some international treaties which attempt to create a somewhat even infrastructure of copyright worldwide. But when you're thinking about the products of the federal government of the United States, the federal government's perspective on what it generates is that it's in public domain, and people can and do all the time scoop those things and import them into their own information systems in the same way that Disney incorporated Brothers of Grimm story into its stories about Cinderella and Snow White. So you can use it, you can import it and use it as fodder for your own materials without mentioning or paying homage or in any way referencing the fact that the source material was the copyright of someone else. Like I don't think any Disney movie that's based on a Brothers Grimm story actually says, based on stories in Brothers Grimm. I could be wrong, but in general, I think they're using works of very, very old stories that come out of copyright to make as an inspiration for their movies. And in the same way, you can do that with data and documents and images. I think probably the most famous image that is in this category is from the archives, which was a White House photographer took pictures of Nixon and Elvis. And that's a public domain image that can be incorporated into other works. Okay, so it's not clear that anything that an AI creates can be copyrighted. So if I went to the doctor and I said, hey, doctor, I've got diabetes and I'm overweight and I want to get back in shape and I want to improve my health, and what do I do? And I say to the doctor, okay, well, give me a hemoglobin A1C test. Well, the results of that test, technically, we could call that something that is a work for hire copyright. Well, we can't call that copyrightable because it's just a fact about the world. So the lab does not own it because it's a fact. The doctor doesn't own it because it's a fact. I don't own it because it's a fact. If I ask my doctor to write a note about what he or she thinks my thing means, when we could argue that is a copyrightable work that the doctor is doing because it's a creative process, an interpretive process. Now, especially if I ask my doctor, I want you to write, I'm super motivated by haikus, doctor. I want you to write me a haiku. And I want you to be creative as you try to motivate me to lose weight. And I asked him or her to write me a note in that way. That would be copyrightable. Now, of course, I won't even go into the fact that HIPAA as a paradigm creates a whole other layer of rights on top of what may or may not be copyrighted. And different states have made different, in the United States at least, have made different rules about who owns what. And for the most part, what HIPAA demands about medical records trumps all of the intellectual property copyright claims about any kind of medical fact. But nonetheless, if I hired a writer outside of the context of HIPAA to write me a haiku about my weight, that would normally be copyrightable. And as you think about, you begin thinking about data, and whether or not the results of extensive data processing, which now can mimic human intelligence, are themselves copyrightable, I believe the answer is that these haikus, I think I stopped at the last one because I was really happy with it. Overindulgent Fred, healthy choices must be made, exercise and eat. That was very nice. And these haikus, it's not clear who owns them, right? I didn't write them. I probably own the copyright to my prompts, and I changed the prompt slightly as I went and I put these data into ChatGPT-4. Since you, the person who's watching this, could be watching it when we're talking about ChatGPT-10, right, which is probably going to be a superior than human intelligence, if it ever gets to that number. Who knows what will happen, but we're dealing with version 4. Version 5 is coming out soon. Version 4 is capable of this. It's not clear that this is who owns the copyright to those haikus. I think it's probably based on the principle of the monkey. Nobody owns the copyright to that. Right? Anyone can use those haikus. So you can copyright data structures. So when you design a database or you design say a hierarchy of directories, which is what's relevant inside the Mirrulation, you can actually copyright that, especially as is the case in Mirrulations, if you had to use some creativity in order to get it to work, right? So that's something that you can license. Because the underlying data is not copyrightable, I think the right thing to do with that data is to merely acknowledge that it is public domain by using the Creative Commons public domain acknowledgement system, which I can't remember the name of that, but there's a creativecommons.org is essentially the idea that you can, well, the open source movement used copyright to make software. It's kind of an unlicensed or copy left instead of copyright. So it has the opposite effect. And I'm going to shrink this window and make it so you can see my hand waving. So the basis of open source is where you say, well, I want to share copyright freely, and I've written some software and I want to share that freely. I'm going to use one of these licenses and to ensure that is freely shared. And the Creative Commons movement, which I don't know if I've got an extra slide here or not. I think I may not have added an additional slide. Let me see if I've got No, I did not.
And
pull that up. Lawrence Lessig released a book called Remix Culture, just Remix. Remix, making art and theater commerce thrive in the hybrid economy. And he talks about essentially people taking things from different sources and remixing them. And the some of his work, he was one of the people who put together the Creative Commons. And the Creative Commons is essentially people realizing we want to do open source type things with copyrights that are not source code copyrights. So going back to here, we could use a Creative Commons public domain dedication to say that the Mirrulations project could decide that it's going to release the database structures, which are different than a separate copyrightable thing from the source code itself. So there's the software license for the source code, but then there's also the database structure license. And I think these are the choices. You could use a software license for the database structure if you wanted, or you could use the middle two are open database licenses, one of which is essentially a permissive versus viral license. The first one's copyleft. When I say viral license, that's the insulting term for what is known as copyleft. So let's say I want to release some copyrighted digital material source code, something else, and let the whole world use it. Well, if I do that, I'm releasing my copyright along with a license to the copyright, and it's a contract that basically says, this is, if you want to use this copyright, you have to agree to these terms. And the terms in general are focused on, hey, you can give this to anybody you want. You can share this. You can use it in your own products. You can do whatever you like, right? And I, as an author, waive my rights. Copyleft goes one step farther and says, you cannot, the one thing you can't do with my code or images or whatever it is, the one thing you can't do is then take my work, incorporate it into your work, and then sell it as though you did the whole thing, right? So you're not going to be able to, limit or kind of move what I've contributed to the whole world back into the private ownership world and start framing things in that way again. And that's what we mean when we say copyleft. And organizations like Microsoft started referring to copyleft licenses for software as viral license, right? Because if you release something under the GPL or the AGPL or even the LGPL, these are copyleft software licenses. And if you used a small component of that in a larger software product, then you were required to release the whole thing as open source as well. And you can understand Microsoft did not care for that. They didn't like that. So they called it a viral license. And I think now that term is almost not insulting, and it's so deep in the parlance, people just don't care anymore. But I think the polite term for it, the term that the people who design those licenses might appreciate is either copyleft or free software. And when they say free, they mean free as in speech, not free as in beer. Or libre, which is a word in many languages other than English that is distinguished from gratis. So gratis in Latin languages means free of cost. Libre means free of restriction, and we're talking about freedom from restriction. Inevitably, though, you have to be a little bit free of cost in order to be free of restriction. So you can't charge for certain things in copyleft licenses. So we can choose to, or Mirrulations, the team can choose to which license it would like to license its database under. If the team does nothing, implicitly the database structure license will be the same as whatever the source code license is, because it's implemented in the source code and therefore kind of subsumed by it. But it's possible if we wanted to, we could choose one of these other licenses that has to then be made compatible with the software license in order for the continued use. But I don't think that's difficult at all. And for the data itself, I think the right answer is you just use Creative Commons has this this mark you can use. It's a little Creative Commons logo, which merely acknowledges that something is in the public domain. And the regulations data that Mirrulations, this project, is thinking about re-releasing, or comment data on top of the regulations, is, I think, for like 3 different reasons, not copyrightable in the public domain. So I am 98% sure that this is going to be correct, because there's just like 3 or 4 reasons why that should be the case. So, and I think technically we could choose to take anything that's public domain and turn around and put our own license on top of it. We could make it into something open source, or we could even make it into something proprietary. However, I think we actually increase the liability on the product if we do that. But by merely saying, here's what we got from the API, here's what we did to the stuff from the API in order to turn it into text in cases where that was necessary. We are doing OCR in the Mirrulations project, so that's a relevant topic. And then we put a warning, and many open source licenses allow you to have essentially an additional disclaimer of liability. And I think that probably the right idea is to release the source code of the project, change it to one of the open source licenses that allows for a further limitation of liability, specifically create a warning.txt or a warning.emd file in the README and in any website that this comes up with, that essentially says, look, this is the data we're getting from regulations.gov. We are doing our best to do a faithful copy, but we cannot fully guarantee that we are perfectly faithfully copying out all the contents of the regulations.gov API. And you're using this at your own risk. And then also that same file should probably say something on, which is, I think, of concern that is a very specific open data concern, is that sometimes open data sets released by the governments have privacy implications that are not obvious. And this definitely does. And the reason is that there's all these people who will comment on regulations and say, here's what I think about this, and they'll sign it. Fred Trotter thinks that. And they'll put their email address in there, and they don't realize that they are signing, they are making a public document. They're using their real name, and that's going to be public and available for everybody forever. The website they are typing into tells them that, but that does not mean that they understand that and that they're aware of the fact that they are potentially revealing, in many cases, very personal information. Especially when you're talking about clinical topics, people are really passionate about any kind of clinical reform, and so they'll go and type into these forums, here's been my clinical experience, really important, dramatic medical experiences, not realizing that they're typing it for the whole world, rather than just for what they might assume is just a government regulator who's listening on the other side. It would be a huge problem for civil liberty if we did not have these transparent, like the underlying principle. I think I've got it written here somewhere in my notes. Not what I want to do. Copyrightability is edicts of government, right? The things that the government releases as law and the things that they use as justifications for the regulations, we really need that to be publicly available discourse, and we need it to be available, because if you don't, you can't see who's influencing the government and why, right? So it's really critical that this be open data, but there are privacy concerns, and people need to be warned about that. And you just make a request. Please don't take advantage of people because of information they put here. It's just not appropriate. Not appropriate to do that. In the same way that if someone goes to your small town and speaks in the town hall and they reveal something embarrassing, you don't blackmail that person the next day. Say, I'll tell the rest of the town who wasn't there at the town meeting, right? It's just not appropriate. You don't do that kind of stuff. So I think probably black hats will take advantage of this data, but I see no reason why black hats, especially foreign states, are not already doing this. So I don't think there's going to be too much new bad stuff happening. I think this is one of the things that people don't understand, that this bad stuff has already been happening. And That's one of the problems on the internet. So I've rambled a bunch. I hope I've put enough QR codes and links to other resources so that you can go run some of these things down. You don't have to trust me that I'm about what I'm asserting is copyrightable is not. I think the websites that I linked to are highly referenced, and I felt like they were good resources. So, but if you're thinking about releasing open data, you definitely need to understand what is copyrightable. It is what is copyrightable, that impacts what is ownable, and then in general, I think the privacy concerns are a special case and need to be thought of when you're really applying these to specifically releasing open data sets as opposed to just people who want to be data vendors and sell data. I think that's all I want to say on the whole topic. I don't think I've seen any questions, so I'm going to wrap this up, and I'm going to send this video over to the Mirrulations team, and you should be watching what they're doing remotely, and they're doing some really exciting work, and I'm really happy with it, and I'm looking forward to making some. Well, they're going to make some announcements, and then I'm going to shop those announcements around because I think they're really important progress being made. So thank you so much. Thank you to today's sponsor, which was waffles, which are pancakes that are not flat. And I hope you have a nice rest of your week and enjoy your weekend. Bye now.